Hi, I'm Randy Lubin from Leveraged Play, and today we're going to talk about state and models for Foresight games, and potentially for other games too. We're going to look at case studies, talk about some of my philosophy for coming up with a model, and there'll be plenty of advice along the way. So to start off, I use model and state interchangeably sometimes, but I think of game state as all of the specific, what are you tracking, whether it's revealed to a player or not, what different values, often quantitatively, but also sometimes there's some qualitative bits that can get in the mix too. And I think of it as like the game state informs the player and shapes their, what decisions they might make. Players then take actions, sometimes from a limited menu or sometimes open-endedly, and then those actions feed back in and update the game state. And the model of how this all comes together would be the model of the game. And so, again, I'll be a little loose with the terms, but that's sort of how I think about game state and model. And not every game needs a lot of game state. This is an illustration of Prussian Kriegspiel wargaming from the 1800s. And one variant of that, free Kriegspiel, involves just a referee who's making it up as they go along based on their expert knowledge and intuitions, but that there isn't a really rigid written down game model. So that's sort of one side of the spectrum. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have some modern board games and, of course, non-consumer war games also, but that are just hyper complex, that involve lots of flowcharts and lookup tables, because what they're representing in the game, they really want to model in extremely high fidelity. And so this is one data point more on the other side of the spectrum, but you can go even more complex than this with whole teams of referees or facilitators. And so really broad spectrum, but we're going to talk about some principles that can be applied sort of anywhere in the middle of the spectrum. So the agenda, we're going to go through a few case studies just to sort of get on the same page for different types of models, like how they might express themselves in games. I'll take those from my own work. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the model design process, and I'll end with some general advice about how to think through models in these games. And again, I'm coming at things mostly from a Foresight games perspective, games that help explore the future, but we also make games that will help explain or help people gain intuition for complex systems, so we'll be drawing on some examples there. But again, this should be advice that might suit itself to more broad types of games and experience design too. So case studies, we're going to start off with two different election game case studies. Machine Learning President was about we made it back in like 2018. It was collaboration with Scout AI and TechDirt and a handful of other collaborators, but it was a big game. This is a mega game with 50 people running around on 14 different faction teams. We were really keen as the designers of the game to explore what coalitions might form in the at that time upcoming 2020 presidential election, as well as how technology might impact the election in unusual ways. And because of that, we knew that we actually wanted a fairly robust and dynamic model that captured a lot of things, but especially when it came to a voter typology and the intersection of that and a lot of the factions and possible policies that might be endorsed. And so we created this behemoth of a spreadsheet. It was over at least 4 or 5 different tabs, and this is only a small portion of one of the tabs where you could see where we were exploring. In this case, what are the policy preferences for each of the player factions? What are the policy preferences for all of the voting factions? So we heavily borrowed from the Pew typology. This is advice I'll get to later, but if there's a good model you can draw on and pull onto your game without that already exists, that can be really powerful. And so here, Pew had done some fantastic work about coming up with like a 9-bucket voter model, and so we kind of cross-referenced a bunch of policies with those voter types with the factions, and that really helped keep the focus on and have some hopefully verisimilitude, some truth to how the factions were going to act and how the voters were going to respond to those actions. And so again, complicated game. We had a whole team of facilitators, lots of players running around, but because so much of the focus was on factions, creating coalitions, and influencing voters, we felt that it merited this really rich and robust spreadsheet approach. So we were tracking, we did a bunch of pre-work to figure out, okay, how does everybody react to these different possible policies? And then during the game itself, we would update, some candidate would make a stump speech and we'd say, oh, they just endorsed policies A, B, and C. Let's go check that off, and then we'll see how voters respond. So this is an example on the high end of the complexity scale. But again, we were really like, how do we really help support the dynamics that we wanted to express with the model itself? Complete other end of the spectrum. Threatcast 2020 was a game we first did for Mozilla, and we ran it a few other times since. This was in late 2019, early 2020, still looking at that 2020 election, but this time with specific research questions around how bad actors might use technology to manipulate the election, specifically with misinformation, disinformation, propaganda. And it was really more of a brainstorm-focused game, so we knew that we didn't really need much in the way of game state or model. We had maybe 20 to 30 players, depending on the session, broken out into 5 different teams representing different actors across the political spectrum and orthogonal to the political spectrum. And we need to have a little bit of game state so that folks could see how their actions were impacting the world and to keep their skin in the game, have some skin in the game, and as well as to just sort of have that narrative arc of, oh, here now it's swaying back and forth of who's ahead in the polls. And so with that, we created a very simple model. I mean, this is pretty much all you see here. We had a very simple model of voters just into 4 voter buckets: far left, center right, far right. And we were also modeling a little bit out in Congress versus for the presidential election. But again, it was not particularly nuanced, light years away from what we were doing with machine learning president. But the idea was like, hey, we just want a little bit of a feedback loop here. And so players it was a brainstorming game. Players were brainstorming these like wild interventions. And again, with the eye of like, we want to get ahead of what bad actors are going to do so we can keep an eye out for it and then mitigate those actions. And so players would brainstorm up these actions, the factions would submit those actions, and we had a small panel of judges who were just quickly going through and saying, yes, great, we think this is going to be high impact or low impact, and here are the groups that it's going to impact. So very, very simple model, made it very easy to facilitate, and still provided some good feedback and reinforcement to the players themselves. The only thing missing here is we also had some other stats that we only checked in on once or twice throughout the game. That was like, how much polarization is there in a world where these tactics are happening, how much trust is there in media, trust is there in politics, etc. So fairly simple model without going all the way to like a Fried Kriegspiel where we're just making it up as we go. So in the end, players would see just these 2 charts. So again, this goes to the fact that you might have a complex model, but players might only see a tiny little bit of it. So actually going way back to Machine Learning President, we were mostly communicating the results of the model through this these mid-round updates where we would have one of our team as a like pundit announcing where the polling was at that moment. And we had an ad buy table, which you could see over on the left, which had the breakout, and we'd share a little bit more about like what do these folks care about. But again, there wasn't that much revealed in terms of this game state, despite underneath the below the surface of the water, or deeper down the iceberg, there's a lot we were modeling. And so Threatcast, there wasn't a lot modeling, and we revealed even a smaller amount. 2 other examples, these are less Foresight related, but still might be interesting or illuminating. Mod Mayhem is a mobile optimized game about trust and safety and content moderation. Our goal with this was to really express just how hard it was, specifically to help give a little more nuance and understanding to players who are on the policy side of things, whether working on Capitol Hill or maybe reporting on it as a journalist, or possibly not on a trust and safety team, but still at a tech company or thinking about starting a tech company. So simple game. We really wanted to just show people that it was hard. It was hard for a number of reasons, due to limited time and resources, due to limited information especially, and especially also due to like competing values or making decision under uncertainty or when values are in tension. So we just knew that like the key thing here was like way too much to do and not enough time to do it in. And in terms of game state that we were really tracking on, we didn't need a ton beyond that to help hammer home those key goals. So we kept things fairly simple. In terms of game state, we were tracking how many of these individual cases that have been reported to your content moderation team, how many did you get through? What percentage of them did you make a decision that your manager agreed with? Oftentimes there is no right answer, but at least at this time, like, did your manager agree with the decision that you made? And then we were also broadly tracking, are your decisions aligned with more pro-free speech or not? And then also, are they leading to a very safe platform or not? And those 2 are orthogonal. And so we were lightly tracking all that so that after each round and at the end of the game, we can say, hey, here's how you're proceeding. You can get fired if you're not going fast enough, or if you're making decisions that, from your manager's perspective, were of poor quality. And then at the end of the game, we let you know how you were on those like safety and speech bars. But again, like very, very lightweight, sort of meters or tracks. The game state here wasn't about that because it was just about like, let's give people a quick, in less than 15 minutes, give them a taste of this complex system and some of the dynamics and the nuance. A very different game we made, also released last year, and also on the same topic, is Trust and Safety Tycoon. And Trust and Safety Tycoon it was much more about getting a nuanced understanding of the real trade-offs at play here, not just from an individual moderation decision, but from coming up with a policy of what you allow on your website as you go. And so in this game, you play as the head of moderation as you go from tiny startup to IPO potentially. And we knew that in order to really help players explore the nuances in this space of what is hard about content moderation and trust and safety, we wanted to provide a lot more indicators of the sort of state of the game and the trade-offs involved. So you can see on the screen here just some of the game state, but along the bottom we had user growth, ad revenue, which is for the company overall, and then mod speed and team morale, which is specific to your team that you're running and growing. And so that as you make decisions on dilemmas, they'll update some of these, and sometimes one meter will go up and another meter will go down, just to show how all of these forces are interrelated. And then also along the right, we're tracking how much confidence did your CEO have in you, what was the conversational health on the platform, and then as different conversation types sort of went up and down to see what were people engaging in on the platform, because the content moderation policies could affect who stuck around on the site or who was drawn to the site. So this is a game that if the previous game, Mod Mayhem, took about 15 minutes, this game took anywhere from 45 to 90 minutes, depending on how much you were deliberating about some of these very, very fraught, complex dilemmas. And so with that, we think we did a really good job at using a model here, choosing the right amount of complexity to show the trade-offs and tensions in a lot of the decisions being made. Often not, our goal wasn't to say, hey, this has a right answer, because most of our specific dilemmas did not have right answers, but merely to show, hey, it's fraught, there's tensions and trade-offs, let's make those tensions and trade-offs really clear. So just another example as to how we use models in a very different way for a game that had a very different goal. So cool, we've gone through some case studies. Let's talk about the process, at least the process I use and have found helpful. Always, I like starting out by defining what are the goals of the model, which is deeply tied to what are the goals of the game. So once you know what the goals for your game are, then within modeling and talking about what game state you want, the model has to accomplish several things. It has to inspire player actions by either creating a good feedback loop or creating a good latent space for play that players go, oh, this is what I want to move the needle on. It can provide player feedback, as I just mentioned, too, so players do a thing, the state updates, that can feel really good and rewarding. Or if it fails, but for an interesting reason, likewise, that could be a really good part of the learning part of the process for one of these games. It's great at demonstrating system dynamics, as I was just talking about with Trust and Safety Tycoon, showing how decisions have trade-offs across a lot of different types of game state. Good for also illustrating then second-order effects, unintended consequences. Good for supporting world building also, in that things that you're tracking, things that you're displaying on the screen can help reinforce what you're trying to build about the world, show that there's a lot going on out there, and sometimes stuff that's being driven by other forces that are beyond any of the players' control, any of the factions that players are playing as. And then finally, it can empower facilitators. So depending on the constraints of your game, you have a limited amount of complexity you can hand off to your facilitators. So Machine Learning President, incredibly complex game state. I was there to run it from the laptop perspective, but we had a whole team of facilitators doing a lot of different work. But it would have been a huge order to help train other facilitators on how to run a game like that. Whereas some of the other games we've made, even Threatcast, would have taken almost no training at all to get somebody able to use that spreadsheet. So models can help offload some of the complexity from facilitators just onto a spreadsheet, or maybe it's a software application or web app. And so it can allow you to do more robust events without having to have a highly trained facilitators, depending on the trade-offs you want to go with on the model side. So anyway, these are all model goals that you should be thinking about. And some of these are definitely in tension with each other. So doing something that was really robustly, demonstrating system dynamics might not empower facilitators, because it might need to be really complex and you might need some training. So these are different goals that might be in tension. If you know what the goal of your game is, then that will illuminate how you prioritize some of these specific ones. Some games might not be about system dynamics at all, and so you might deprioritize that as a specific goal for your model. But once you sort of have a sense of what are the key priorities that your model has to do to support the gameplay, and and outcomes that you want, you can start building up a model. And I think of things as going from more complex to more simple, and where reality is this fractally entangled mess, and there's just infinite depth that you can go in terms of trying to figure out how does the world actually work. Nobody actually can know that in its entirety. But then experts can actually get quite complex with their models. Sometimes those are quantitative models. Sometimes those are intuitions and guts and mental models. But that's sort of like the next stage down, that people who are living and breathing this day to day, whether from an academic perspective, research perspective, or practitioner, maybe they're in the field, maybe they're, for our trust and safety games, we interviewed a lot of people working at tech companies in the trust and safety team, and they have these super complex mental models and intuitions, and so that's really great and really messy, but you can't distill that all down to a game either. So from there you often go, and designers will come up with a game model or toy model, a much simplified version from what experts are thinking about things, but hopefully is able to adequately convey the dynamics of whatever it is you want to represent in a good enough way to meet those goals we were just talking about, support the players in their journey, support the game toward the outcome that you need, but without getting into the super complex territory where experts are at. And then finally, as we talked about a little bit earlier, then players have their own exposure to the model. They're probably not going to see the entire model, but really only a little bit via a scoreboard or some other way of updating their state. So, in our election games, that was showing them the polling numbers, but not showing them everything happening under the iceberg, because they under the water, because they didn't need that. So, a lot of this thinking through models from from complex reality down to what's in the game, down to what do we show players, is a helpful way of differentiating the different types of models that might come into the design process. Just for an example or two, this is the infamous diagram about the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan and trying to deal with counterinsurgency there. And this is a expert model that is extremely hard to make any sense of or use from a lay perspective, or even from a game design perspective to some degree. On the other end of the spectrum, but still fairly complex. On the other end of the spectrum, you have toy models, much simpler. This is a still from Lubin, which is a simple system dynamics modeling tool from Nikki Case. But the idea is that you can sketch on a napkin sort of, hey, this thing leads to a positive impact here, negative impact there, and here's how things sort of flow through the system. Oftentimes we'll build little models out in spreadsheets, and so we'll say, hey, player takes action X, how does that affect all of the game state? And so this is much more akin to how you'll be thinking about things from a toy model. This example here is looking at automation reducing jobs but leading to more profits, and you can play around with different ways of how might policy outcomes affect what happens with society. But the idea is that the toy model is obviously going to be missing a ton in terms of real world dynamics, but hopefully it's simple enough to convey what you need for the game. So let's talk process for a sec. So usually our process when we talk about what is the right model for the game, what do we want to include and what do we want to ignore, we start by researching the topic a ton, speaking with lots of experts, and usually there's a lot of getting the experts to articulate how they think the world actually works, or how they go about making decisions if they're one of the key actors in that system, or represent an organization that is a key actor in that system. And oftentimes if we're working with clients, we'll find that sometimes as much as half the value from commissioning a game comes from the game design process. And I think a lot of it's right here in this, forcing them to be really explicit in terms of how they think the world works and what are the key dynamics, what are the second order effects. And so there's there can be a lot of time in this process of just let's make sure that the experts, the client, everyone's sort of on the same page for how we want to model reality. And then, it's about okay, we have a lot of different opinions, a lot of different perspectives, sometimes a lot of different professional models. How do we, articulate all of these models and then decide to start distilling it down to one game model? And so it's about, and then you can craft your game model in affordances and always play test and iterate, because you're not going to get it right on the first time. There's probably going to be weird edge cases. You might realize that certain types of players or player characters don't have the right information they need, or don't have a way of pushing back on the world in an interesting way. So that's where playtesting and iteration, or play storming, where you're just sort of talking it through as if you were playing the game, can be really illuminating in terms of, are we on the right track in terms of the right model? So in terms of crafting your model, some more specifics here, to the extent that you can map mental models to specific player actions and affordances, that's really great. So it's like, okay, well, what are players going to do? How might that actually affect the model? Start at a high level and then dig deeper and deeper. Or likewise, what does the information we're sharing via, say, a player scoreboard or a state of the world dashboard, what does that suggest that players might want to do? Because whatever you communicate tells players, oh, maybe that's important. Maybe that's something I should scheme around or prioritize acting on. Tied into, I've talked on the channel before about using a stage gate approach. I think that's super relevant here. So exploring multiple different options in parallel for, well, how might we model the world? What game state might we include? Doing that in parallel is really great at teasing out the tensions and trade-offs between different approaches. And ideally you like playstorm or playtest a few of them in parallel and say, okay, cool, we really need to capture this state over here. We really don't need this state over here. Cool. And as you do that, keep evaluating against your goals and constraints, not just for your model, but for the game overall. Because it could turn out that you have like some great idea for how to capture and model reality, or something that'll be really fun and interesting from a player perspective, but it just doesn't align with the goals and the outputs that you need to get from your game session. So, that says, okay, this is really clever. Maybe we'll get to use it in a future game, but it's not the right fit for this game right now. Let's go with some other option. Other advice, and we'll get back to more advice in a second, but just cutting scope wherever you can. There's always a temptation, if you fall in love with the subject, to just include all the little interesting bits and bobs and all the different ways that there's externalities and second order effects, and cut wherever you can. Cut scope. You want the model and the game to be sort of as simple as possible and no simpler kind of thing. And so look for those opportunities to say, hey, look, this is going to add cognitive load to the players or to the facilitators. Let's cut it. We don't need it. We can accomplish the goal of our game without representing whatever this is in the game state. And then, of course, playtest and iterate, as I mentioned before, that really will help you refine the model, see what's working, see what's lacking, see how else you can use the model in the game state to support your players and ultimately your outcomes. And I'll touch on this. This is really a subject that can be a video of its own. But how do players affect the model? Like, what actions can they take and how does those actions feed back in? There are so many different approaches for so many different types of games. But I'll just call out a few here real quickly because it's so relevant to like what we were just talking about in terms of like the affordances for the model. And so on the player action side, I mean, they can be open-ended interventions where they're brainstorming. They have like pretty much anything they can dream up as long as it's even remotely plausible. And then you need some way of adjudicating. Or it could be that you're providing players with multiple choice options and you've pre-coded how each of those options will affect game state. So in the Trust and Safety Tycoon or in Moderator Mayhem, we already know when players make an action exactly how that's going to update game state. There's no facilitator in the loop there. And then another approach that sort of can work with any of it or all of this is like an action economy where maybe a player has 5 points of actions to spend or 10 units of currency token to spend, and they have a menu to choose from. And so likewise, those choices can be hardwired into how they affect the model. And just because it's hardwired doesn't mean that there aren't second order effects and non-linearities, especially as some of the actions intersect. It just means that it's all been coded up in advance. And then on the action adjudication side, it could be deterministic. So in Trust and Safety Tycoon, if you take, on Dilemma 5, if you take option A, it's always going to have the exact same effect on the model. You can also involve randomness, whether that's a dice roll or some other form of like adding uncertainty how an action can work. That could be powerful for players. Or likewise, if there's something that involves some judging and judgment, but you don't want to put too much on the facilitator or judges. Decision because you want to add some noise, you want to add some uncertainty, you can totally say, hey, look, there's some randomness involved here. Or finally, it could be all facilitator fiat, which can work if you have a really expert facilitator who just wants to keep the game moving, especially if there's more simple game state. Cool, facilitators are going to make a quick decision and we're going to move on. Player voting is another opportunity for action adjudication where, especially if it's not just a head-to-head zero-sum kind of situation, you can ask, okay, let's just open up to the floor, quick show of hands, who thinks this would be highly effective, moderately effective, barely effective, or not effective? Or that type of thing to quickly pull the room. And if you have a room full of people who are subject matter experts, that can be effective also. But yeah, again, there's infinite depth we can go into on this subject, and maybe we will in a future video. So continuing on with just a bit of modeling advice. This is going to be a sort of potpourri of different things that might help, but first off, mind your complexity budget. Complexity budget's a term I use a lot, and applies to a lot of different types of game design, but the idea is that you have limited time, limited resources. limited facilitator training time as well, and if players, of course, and everyone will have only so much cognitive load that they can direct to the game, and so be really mindful of that. Know how complex you can make a game. For the machine learning president game, we knew we based on our goals, we knew it kind of had to be complex, and we had a lot of complexity budget to play with. There were still things that we had to cut because it was still bounded, but we knew that was a large budget. For other games, we're like, okay, we have no time to train facilitators, so we have to keep this simple to facilitate. So really being explicit about complexity budget, and then as you design the game, what trade-offs you're willing to make, goes a long way. And part of that is focusing on what matters, knowing, okay, like there's a bunch of interesting adjacent topics and dynamics we can cover, but we know the core of the game is about X. For election the Threatcast 2020, it was about how are bad actors using technology? Might they use technology? So we knew we can carve away complexity on everything else and use our limited complexity budget just around the bad actors. And in that case, it wasn't even on the modeling side, but it was on some of the player aids and handouts were all focused on emerging technologies and how bad actors might use them. Likewise, provide players with feedback to the extent that it's relevant and helpful. Players love seeing how their actions affect the world, and it will encourage them to take bigger, bolder, and more interesting and hopefully more accurate or illuminating actions as the game continues. Align with facilitator constraints. That aligns with things that we're talking about earlier, but like if you know that you're not going to be able to train facilitators or that they're not going to be tech savvy, say, design a game that they can facilitate well and have that know what that is going to be from the beginning of the design process, so you don't get halfway in and go, we've designed this awesome game that no one's going to be able to run, because that would be an unfortunate waste of time. And so finally, one thing I love on the modeling side is like look for real world games. This is a little bit beyond modeling anyway, but I think of real world games as things that are gameful that already occur in the world in whatever domain you're covering that you can leverage. So for instance, an election is effectively a game, two factions or more competing, and then the game is over on election day and you get the results and you see who won. Cool, that's really easy to port into a game. Other things that are real world games with competition and winners could be everything from like competing for market share, where you're trying to dominate a market, or perhaps in a negotiation, who's going to get the best deal out of a negotiation, or if you're keeping an eye on like an internal stock market, who can make the most money betting on that market. So there's lots of real world game like patterns that can then be ported over into your game, and oftentimes that's fun, and it's fun and it's legible, and there's real world patterns that make your design process easier too, and easier to teach to players also, because they've been exposed to elections for their whole life. They know how elections work. Cool, now they can be off to the races, and also bring over some of the dynamics that they've seen play out in elections before into your game. Finally, some quick advice on working with experts. Read existing guides and explainers to give you a good context. Oftentimes there's great white papers put out by all sorts of NGOs or think tanks. Sometimes they have explicit models in there, sometimes not. But if you're talking with experts, ask them about the mental model. Ask them to walk you through how they would solve a problem or come up with a decision, how they prioritize. And that's really great to hear. And oftentimes, like there won't be a publicly available, written out, published model for how something works, but experts, they know, they live and breathe this stuff, and they can sometimes really clearly articulate, oh yeah, here's exactly how this dynamic would play out. Here's how I think about it. Here's how I would project forward the next few moves in whatever dynamic space. And so again, that can be really illuminating for you and really illuminating for the experts. Sometimes they're doing it on such a gut intuitive level that being forced to explain it to you, they go, oh, wow, cool. I'm going to now go write up a memo and send it out to the rest of the org because I think they would like to hear about this too. Always I like to think about anti-patterns. So, so some anti-patterns, things that you should consider not doing or be wary of as they come up. And that's not saying never do these, but just be wary. There's sometimes a temptation or pressure to gamify things in a like add points in leaderboards or badges. I find oftentimes that is orthogonal to a good play experience, and that your complexity budget is better spent capturing the like real dynamics of the system you're talking about. That isn't always true, but I would say that oftentimes this is like gamification, but not deep systems game design. A second bullet here, overly expansive or detailed models. We've touched on this, but like there's a temptation to go really broad and capture everything. You don't need to. Don't overextend your complexity budget. Make sure you're focused on the things that matter. So if you find yourself tempted to say, oh, and we can model this with its own subsystem, with its own custom whatever, or if we have another facilitator, they can track this other thing over here. always err on the side of cutting down that scope and focusing on what really matters. And that's sort of tied into overburdening facilitators. Oftentimes, especially if you're going to be running things multiple times, you're going to be relying on facilitators who might be very enthusiastic, but have very little time for training, might not be tech savvy, etc. So design for sort of the lowest common denominator facilitator that you might be expected to be working with, and really make sure you're setting them up for success. And then finally, there's an anti-pattern I often see around designing for replayability. I think there's something, as a designer, you're often you're playtesting and prototyping and thinking a lot around this game, more so than anyone who's ever going to play it. And there's an impulse to say, hey, we want this game to be different every time, to be, replayable, and to really reward people for going deep. Well, you're going to be lucky. You're lucky to have people play a game through once. And oftentimes you really don't need to design for replayability, especially for the more serious games that are played in workshops. Like, this thing's only going to be played once. Like, if you're designing because you want a variance of different scenarios and you're trying to do some analytical analysis, yeah, you might want to design a broad spread of scenarios, but like, from a player perspective, you probably don't need replayability, and that will probably help you save time in terms of creating content and model complexity for the game. So that's another like common impulse I see in designers, and you just often don't need to be designing for replay value for these Foresight games, these serious or applied games, at least not for player replayability, maybe for facilitator replayability to achieve your goals, but that should be directly tied to the specific outcomes that you're trying to drive from the game process. All right, so with all that said, I'm going to read one of my favorite microfiction short stories, which is very relevant to modeling. It's from Borges. It's called On Exactitude in Science, and here's the entirety of the short story. In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that a map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire, the entirety of a province. In time, these unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers Guild struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, and which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that the vast map was useless. And not without some pitilessness was it that they delivered it up to the inclemencies of sun and winters. In the deserts of the West, still today, there are tattered ruins of that map, inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land, there is no other relic of the disciplines of geography. And it being Borges, he attributes it to Suarez Miranda. But this is Borges' short story. I love this. It's very, the map is not the territory, and it would be impossible to have a map that truly represents the territory. So I love thinking about this when I think about models. I hope you enjoyed that too. But that is it for this talk. I hope this was illuminating. If you have other insights on how to design models for Foresight games and other games, I would love to hear them, either in the comments or come join the Foresight games community, foresight.games. Lots of folks who are thinking about how to design these applied games, and working in the real world, in video game space also. Just all over the place. Really great group of folks. And if you're ever interested in commissioning a game, please reach out. My studio is Leveraged Play. Once again, I'm Randy Lubin. Thanks, and take care.